when I want people to be all impressed. So my name is Diane James. I'm the instructional designer with LEO, which is the Learning Engagement Office. And I'd like to say hello to everyone here in the room and hello to our folks who are joining us through the virtual activity that Alex is taking care of. So we have some folks that are joining us through online means. Okay, we'll take a small momentary pause. We're good?
Yeah.
All right, excellent. I think the last time it took us a little longer to do that. Thank you, Alex. So today I want to talk to you about rubrics and criterion referencing and why does that matter in your classroom. So this came from a conversation that I had with an instructor a couple of months ago. And we were sitting in a team debrief. And we were talking about the assessment that had been put together for this particular course. And this course was face-to-face, but there was an alternative course that was also online. And we started having this conversation because the instructor, who had come from a particular background where norm referencing was used a lot, and they hadn't quite sort of grasped the concept of how to assess your students based on criteria and rubrics rather than basing them on each other's performance, which is what normative is. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about what criterion referencing is all about, the value of it, some of the ideas behind it, some of the theory, move into rubrics, and then start to give you some sense as to how you can frame those rubrics in ways that will help with the assessment ultimately in your classroom. So the first thing to think about is what are criterion referenced assessments. And Peter, you'll have to forgive me because I'm going to naturally have my back over this way. So I'll just come over here and talk to you about these people here.
The same problem when I was teaching.
Oh, no worries. These rooms are lovely and long, but sometimes you forget. I don't want to turn my back on you. So criterion references assessment. Basically, it's the process of evaluating and grading the learning students against this preset specific group of qualities or criteria. So value, everybody knows what to expect. And so when you look at the what is criterion referencing, you start to recognize that these pre-specified qualities, these things that you actually want the students to be able to do or think or show, are not done in comparison to other people. They're actually done against a set of criteria. And that's one of the differences between criterion referencing and normative referencing. These criteria, qualities, are what students have to do during the assessment. So that's really quite important. You have to sort of give them a way to demonstrate that they've learned something through the outcomes that you've asked them to achieve. So you sit with your syllabus, for example, or your class notes, and you've got a series of learning outcomes I want the student to be able to at the end of, and then you have to sort of set a way for them to know what it is that you want them to do, and then how it is that they know they've achieved it or how they've accomplished it. And that's what the criterion referencing is about. It also describes how well they will do at different levels. So what are the standards or performance descriptors that are presented in a rubric? So basically the criterion referencing is a set of pre-specified qualities or criteria, what you want the students to have to do, and how well they will do this, described at different levels. So what's the value of the criterion referencing? First of all, what it does is it creates a shared language. So students and others who are taking part in the learning actually understand what it is you want them to do. So it minimizes the confusion that would happen So when you're giving a student a rubric, it's literally sort of saying, if you want to wow me, make sure all this is checked off. If you want to just make sure that you're doing okay and everything's on target, make sure this is checked off. And if you absolutely want to go down that road where you're not going to get the full marks, make sure you do this. And it gives students a really good sense of where it is that they need to be. So instead of trying to read your mind, and I no longer have a partner because of that, I don't mind read very well. So if I can't read your mind, Helen, and I'm looking at you and going, oh, what does she want for this assignment? How does it work?
Sorry, can you just confirm what CRT stands for?
Oh, Criterion Referenced Testing.
Thank you.
Sorry. My apologies. So Criterion Reference Assessment, or Criterion Reference Testing, is an important foundation for engaging with students. So you want to share your language. You want to identify what's valued. I want you to be able to describe. I want you to be able to perform. I want you to be able to analyze. I want you to be able to synthesize. I want you to be able to compare and contrast. What is the value in the curriculum and what is it measured by? So everybody knows when it comes to value what it is you want them and expect them to be able to do. You choose the criteria that suits the learner's performance, and along with written feedback, you have a way to show the students how to improve. So when I say compare and contrast, that gives the value, that lets them know what it is that I'm going to measure, how I'm going to measure, and it also then says to the student at the other end, in your comparison, you forgot to do this, or in your contrasting, you might have thought about that. And that gives them a way of sort of not only seeing on the rubric what it is you want, but also the language in which you have also identified their specific flaw or need, place for improvement. It also makes explicit to students and assessors the evidence of the achievement that's expected. So you have a department or an institution, we have the University of Alberta, we've got various program offices represented here. They all have various ways in which something is expected to be done. So in some cases, for example, in occupational health and safety, some students need to hit 70% in order to accomplish the work that they need to accomplish. Others, it's 50%, and others, it might be just pass or fail, depending on the circumstance. It enables reliable and valid judgments about the student's work. So it literally sort of tells the student, here's how I'm going to judge you. Here's the validity of what I'm going to ask from you. And so therefore, I want you to, in turn, to recognize that I have taken the assessors and streamlined it so that it makes sense. What I started in the learning outcomes becomes part of the assessment and is what I taught in the middle, which is the content. So these three things are all tied together. It creates relevant feedback to students about the quality of their work. So just by looking at the rubric, they can sort of judge where they see themselves. And that's where a conversation can come in play as well. Because if a student thinks, oh, I was in the wow category on this one, and you've put me in the adequate category over here, now there's time for a conversation. What is it that I didn't do over here that I thought I did that put me over here? So it might be that I thought I did X, Y, and Z, but in actual fact, I did Y and Z. I forgot about X, and I missed that. So I have an opportunity as an instructor to go back and say, here's the quality, here's why we made this issue. And then what's required for improvement? So basically, how can you do better? So if you end up in the adequate category and you really want to be in the wow category, what do I have to do to make that happen? So we've all been in classrooms where we've had instructions given to us by instructors, and those instructions are unclear to be kind, and they often will be a little convoluted, and they're all over the place. And you think to yourself as a student, I'm not sure what's wrong, so I'll sit there and I'll take a pen, old-fashioned, I'll take a pen, and I will underline, do this, at this pace, during this time, and try and break it down into components that make sense to me. And so what rubrics do and criterion referencing does is it does a lot of that for the student. So instead of you just saying, I want you to write a paper, and it can be on anything, and I'm going to grade it at the end without you knowing why or how or what I'm going to use to judge that paper. Right? So all of those things are not going to be necessarily organized or clear or even made sense to the student. So it really is quite important for those kinds of relevant feedbacks to be able to be set. And some of them can be set in the rubric and some of them can be added in your writing. The other value is that it enables evaluations of how well students have achieved their unit learning outcomes. And also it identifies teaching, learning, and assessment practices that might need reviewing. So if you have if you've set up a rubric or criterion referencing and you're teaching the material and teaching the information to the students, then you may be in a situation where you find that a vast majority of the students are having issues with something that you've put together. Well, that's a perfect opportunity for you to do some self-reflection, for you to go back and identify, maybe there's a section in here that I really need to pay attention to. Maybe there is something that I could change in terms of the way I teach, in the way that my students learn, or in the assessment practices that might be available to them. It also supports students to develop strong self-evaluation capacity. So if you teach your students how to use rubrics, over time, they will start to see the rubric as a natural adjunct to the materials that you've asked them to do within their assessments. So that natural opportunity for them to sort of say, okay, here's the paper I have to write, and here's the topic I need to write on. And even if they don't add any extra information, the rubric will tell me what the quality is. It'll tell me what kinds of convention might be needed, for example, whether it follows APA or whether it follows some other writing style. It will tell me what kind of argument I should make. It would let me know what kind of focus the paper should have. There's all sorts of things that a rubric will do to allow students to actually use it as a self-evaluatory tool, to allow them to review, refine, and improve their own work. So fundamentally, there are some benefits with CRA. The assessment process is transparent, and they receive grades that can be traced to their specific performance. So how many people here have had instructors where they've gone and done a test and thought, I don't recognize anything on this test as anything that was taught in that class in the last 3 months? Anyone? Because I can put up my hand right off the bat. I have been in classes where I've thought, what is this? This doesn't make, I read the textbook, I went to every class, I took copious notes, I talked to my classmates, and now I'm looking at an assessment that actually doesn't make any sense. And I'm thinking, where did this come from? I've not been prepared for it. Nobody sort of gave me a heads up. It wasn't like it was a case study or an application of material. It was literally words I didn't recognize. I think, how do I get here? And this was in 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th year university. It wasn't just high school. And so I'm thinking to myself, oh, this is not good. So this particular way of creating criterion referencing allows the student to sort of say, in advance of any assessment, why it's happening, what it's happening for, how it's happening, and how I can trace that particular performance back to what was actually taught in the classroom. So it connects it. So anyone who's gone through the instructional design process with me knows that you start with your learning outcomes. Here's what I want the student will be able to do at the end of. Lots of action verbs, lots of ideas about what the context is going to be. You move over to the assessment, because these have to be tied together. So you move over to the assessment, and the assessment actually tests for the learning outcomes. And that's where the criterion referencing comes in, because you take the information that you've got in your learning outcomes and you apply them in a transparent way so that they can trace their particular performance. And then you go to the content and you say, oh, okay, I want the student to do this. I'm going to test them on how they do that. Maybe I should talk about this in the middle. Just maybe. Maybe I need to make that direct connection, because I can have the learning outcome, I can have the assessment, but if I don't actually tie it to what I'm teaching in the classroom at that moment in time, the connection may not get made. So you will get the odd student who, despite you, will actually learn something. They'll have the content in the textbook, they'll have their other classmates, and they'll listen to your lecture and they'll think, okay, I can make these connections myself. But the vast majority of students are new to the topic area, often new to your discipline. You're trying to immerse them into this way of thinking that your discipline sort of expects. And in doing so, you need to make those overt connections. So you make the connection between what they came in to learn, what they have learned, and then how you phrase and focus the learning. And so that allows the assessment process to be transparent, and the students can understand what grade they got. They can understand why they got this grade, and so on. It also enables students to report achievement or progress on a series of key criteria rather than on a single grade or percentage. Because we've all been in that class too, where you go for 6 or 8 or 10 or 13 weeks, and at the very end you get a grade, and no idea why. Could be a good grade, could be a bad grade, could be a medium grade, but still no idea why. I went to all the classes, I did all the things that were expected of me, but I still don't know how I got to where I got. So criterion referencing can help with that as well. So in terms of criterion referencing, there's two sides to the same coin. So one is the criteria, and one are the standards, or what we call performance descriptors. And each of those together make a marking rubric. So if you look at our example here, the criteria are down along the side. So we want to demonstrate an understanding of the topic, develops and supports an original idea, addresses audience, speaks clearly. So it's a presentation rubric. The application, they exercise rhetorical skills, emphasis, timing, pacing, reasoning, questioning. And then when you have the criteria, I'm mixing them up. When you're over here with the criteria, you've got thorough understanding, considerable, moderate, emerging. So you're literally sitting there and saying, okay, this person was effective, acceptable, effective, emerging. Here's the grade. They know exactly what they did and how they did it. Add to that some feedback, some actual written comments as to why they got these spaces. And suddenly you have a complete assessment that allows the student to not only see where they are presently, but also where they can improve. So as you can see here, the criteria along the side, performance rating along the top, and then the descriptors in the center. Yes?
Back to that previous rubric. So you don't have to have numbers along the side, along the top for exceptional, effective, acceptable, and developing.
No, you don't have to.
So how would you come up with the 9?
Well, some people choose to. So I could easily say that this particular presentation was worth 16%.
Yeah.
Right. And then I have identified, and I may in my head sort of say this is worth 1, this is worth 2, this is worth 3, this is worth 4, or 2, 4, 6, 8, or whatever. You can also program your EClass if you're having your EClass, your rubric in EClass. You can actually set up your EClass so that it will also assess when you click these 4. The numbers that are associated with it will be put in play. In this particular example, I just haven't used grade, just that there are. So if I were doing this at 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9. With the idea being 4 and 4, 8, 8 and 8 are 16. So if they got all exceptional, they'd get 16 out of 16.
Right. Okay, so I guess my point being that it's not necessary to have numbers across the top.
No.
That you have to add up.
It's not necessary. It doesn't hurt to have numbers, That's a whole sort of different way of thinking about criterion referencing by actually attaching numbers to the criteria. And it does make it easier if you're doing it manually, but you can set those weights on the EClass, and my EClass colleagues will be able to help with those kinds of things. And then, so when you check, if you're in EClass and you're marking and you check these, they'll automatically add up, depending on the weight that you've given them. But sometimes, some people give them 1, 2, 3, 4. Some people will give them 2, 4, 6, 8. Depends on sometimes what this final grade is. Like, so something's worth 20%, they might weight it in various and different ways.
So that works if you don't have a range.
Sure. And ranges are useful too, because when I use a rubric, if I use a number system in a rubric, I'll be more likely to use a range than I will a single number. So while this one says 1, 2, 3, 4, I might have made this one, let's say 12 to 16. This one might be 10 to 12. This one might be 5 to 10 or 5 to 9. And this one might be 1 to 0 or 1 to 4. Because it gives me some opportunity within these to be a little bit more flexible. So I might say this person got exceptional, but I might give them maybe 3 out of 4 instead of 4, just because if I have this bigger number to work with, this range to work with. So if that makes sense.
I was just going to say too, not all the column or not all the rows have to have the same numbers attached to them
No,
either.
they don't.
Like sometimes I put students if they've done their citations or not, which is maybe out of 2, but I care more about the content, like the knowledge understanding. So that might be a range out of 10.
Right.
Right. So there still gives them that feedback about whether they're highly competent or developing.
Right.
But they're not all weighted the same.
Right. So in this case here, you might have this might be, I don't know, let's just say, this might be rather than an equal breakdown, although this one looks pretty equal actually, I would probably make this one equal. But let's assume that it's not equal, then I might make this one a 4, this one a 3, this one a 1, and this one a 2, or something like that, and shift it around. It depends. Part of the reason I didn't go into numbers at this point is because it really depends on you. That's an individual conversation that you have with yourself, with your content, and hopefully with an instructional designer. Because when you have that conversation, you can then sit down and flesh out, is this more important than that? Is this less important than that? And those kinds of things you can work out. And if it makes you comfortable, and you feel it's a layer of knowledge you want the student to have access to when they're making decisions about where they want to fit on this category. Because I have had students, if this is a pass, they'll land here. They got kids, they got communities, they got church groups, they got work, they're traveling all the time. I need to get this done. So they'll actually work to land here. I've got other students who will land to work over here all the time. Like they'll put 1,000 hours into something that's only worth 10%. And so where you decide the level of timing and money, if you like, in terms of their numbers, you can do that yourself with help. Sorry.
I've tried doing this, and usually what I get back is, so what's a 2? What's a 2? What's a 3?
Right.
And when I've used rubrics like that, I teach English, so language is
Important.
sometimes an issue.
Yeah.
So high degree, considerable, moderate, and emergent doesn't necessarily mean a lot to them. So what I do is I put knowledge and understanding, and then I put the description of what a 4 is
Right.
under the 4.
Right.
Hopefully using shared language, like you said, something that I'm sure they would understand or that we've talked about in class.
Yeah.
So for me, numbers don't work because of that, because they still come back to me and say, like, what's a 2, what's a 2, or what's a 3?
Right. Right. And I get that. And one of the things that's really important about when you use a rubric is you don't just hand over the rubric. explain to them what it's about, which is probably even more critical, and you may do that, but it's even more critical if there's a language issue. So more and more of our classes have multiple languages within the classroom. And so I think it's critical because not only is the student learning your discipline, so the language of the discipline is new to them, but it may in fact be the language of the teaching is new as well. And it's just a matter of really sitting down and explaining to them. I never give a rubric to a student that I haven't sat down and said, this is what it's for. This is how I use it. This is why I use it.
And we usually give it with the assignment.
Right.
So they have the rubric, they know how to be assessed while they're working.
Right, but if you've got questions, if they don't know why something is the way it is, take 5 minutes before the test to just sort of explain the rubric, or even 5 after, or if you're going to use a standard rubric, even at the beginning of the term, explain how, in a generic way, why you're using the ones you're using. So rather than exceptional, effective, acceptable, and developing, you might use, as you've said, 4, 3, 2, 1, which might be the way that you might choose to do that. I've also done it so that, you know, it's like I've given myself a range. So even though somebody is in a developing area, I can give them the high end of developing because they're really so close to this one. Or I can give them the low end of developing because they really are missing the mark and haven't quite made it over to the next level yet. So it allows me a little bit of extra structure and time. So writing assessment criteria, what's the purpose? So one of the things that I tried to do in each of this presentation is just to highlight the really key messages that I want you to take away with you. So really when it comes to writing assessment criteria, you want to give students information about the qualities, characteristics, and aspects of the assessment task. So you really want to clue in as to what it is that they are going to be expected to do. You also want to make sure the criteria makes it clear to the students what factors are going to be taken into account, right? So when you're creating a criteria, and I have some examples a little further along, you're literally sort of saying, here are all of the contingencies under which I wish this to be done. So you might say, I want you to write a reflective paper. The reflective paper should have the following characteristics or aspects. I would like it to be 4 pages long or a maximum of 2,000 words. I would like it to be in this particular format or that particular format. And then I'm going to let you know that I'm going to be thinking about how the quality of your argument, the way in which you present your references, the way that you conclude your reflection, and how you think about how that you might improve going into the future. So you've given them information about the quality, the characteristics, the aspects of the task. You've made it clear what factors are going to be taken into account to when I judge their performance. So it could be argued that the most direct way that students experience what is needed to achieve the unit's learning outcomes is through the assessment criteria. So it's really getting them to understand what it is that you're asking of them. So whether it's a language issue or whether it is a content issue, either way, it's critical that your students understand what it is that you're trying to achieve. So I will tell them about why I teach the way I teach. I will give them some hint as to the kinds of teaching I expect. I'll say, listen, I'm a constructivist. You don't know what that means, but I'll tell you. It means that I expect you to construct knowledge from other things that you've experienced. I want you to bring your experiences and your ideas into the conversation. And then as I introduce new ideas and concepts to what you're doing, I then want you to start to build and construct new ways of thinking about the topic that we started with over here. Because you walked in with a very set idea as to how to teach. I want you to bring that to the conversation. Then I want to talk to you about some of the things that I think about teaching. And then when you go out that door, you might want to try some of them. You might want to incorporate some of them into the way that you think about teaching. So that is how you would write assessment criteria. So the elements, each criterion starts with a verb. The verb indicates to the students the level of the cognition that you're looking for. Notice I've got little numbers on here. You'll see why in a minute. The rest of the criterion is similar to a learning outcome in that it provides content about what the student should be doing something with and the context in which they should be doing it. So you can use your learning outcomes as ways to think about how you might craft your criterion. The key to a well-written criterion is that it works as an instruction. So it literally tells the student what it is you're expecting from them. I expect you to use APA. So for those of you who may not use APA, that's, basically all the style guide at the end of their references. When taken together as a group, the set of assessment criteria for any task can be read by anyone, and they would have a reasonable level of clarity as to what the task entails. So I should be able to go into your English language class, read your rubric, and be able to identify immediately what it is you're asking for the student to do. Okay? What do you teach?
Architecture.
I should be able to go into your architecture class, take your rubric, and figure out what it is you want to teach. Right? I should be able to go into your class, be able to see, because you're a business, right? Yeah.
HR and training and development.
HR and training and development, excellent. So I should be able to go into your training course and be able to tell through the rubric exactly what it is you're expecting from me. Right? Because the rubric needs to be that clear. It needs to literally have that level of connection with the content so that the student, even if they dropped and their dog ate their homework, they could still tell through the rubric exactly what you wanted them, what you want from them. So assessment criteria provides students the answer to the question, what do I have to do? And how do I do that? Right? And those are the two things most teachers tear their hair out over. Student doesn't get what it is they have to do and they don't understand how they have to do it. So those are the two things that I think are probably most critical in terms of criterion and why you would use them. So remember I had the little 1 and 2? I'm sorry, I don't have a split screen, so I'll have to flip back and forth. So remember, starts with a verb. Advise a client. That's the first thing they have to do. The verb indicates to the students the level of cognition. The options available to them. So you go in to talk to a client, you need to be able to tell them what options are available to them. Within the civil justice and dispute resolution landscape, it provides content, what students should be doing with, and the context, as well as it works with as an instruction. So right off the bat, this particular criterion, advise a client about what options are available to them within the civil justice and dispute resolution landscape. I think all of us could walk out of here and do that one, because we know we have to advise, we know we're working with clients, we know we have to figure out options, and we know within the context in which we have to make that decision. So when I say I want you, as part of this paper, to do this, you know exactly what it is you have to do. Now you might have subtle questions. How many clients? Should I pick more than one option? Students love this stuff. Can I just focus on civil justice and not on dispute resolution? They'll ask for subtleties, but fundamentally most of them will walk into the classroom and be able to tell what you want them to do. What about justify the theoretical elements and practical strategies of the plan and a rationale that explains your thinking and demonstrates connections to relevant theory and research? Could you do it? Just break it down. Justify, so you have to come up with the reasons why you want to do this. What are the theoretical elements and practical strategies of the plans? To create a rationale that explains your thinking and demonstrates the connections to theory and research. Reflect on the relevance of the context to your creative practice, of the content to your creative practice. So you need to reflect, what's the relevance of the content, and the framework is your creative practice. Interpret and analyze data from your lab experiment, right? Apply knowledge of the concept of osmosis to the membrane structure. I can go out and do that tomorrow. Some of these things require some knowledge, of which I have none. Outline the likelihood and impact of risks. Right? Explain how the specified use of technology is appropriate for context, students, and discipline. So these are criteria, examples of criteria where you've taken a verb, you've created an action, and then you've told them within what context you want to do it. So the characteristics of the standard descriptors. So the standards, so if you remember, the criterion are the things that are running along the side, and the descriptors are the things that are in the center. So the job of the descriptor is to do two things. First, they inform students of the qualities and the elements of their work. And they're looked for in an order to determine how well they have performed against each criterion. So remember I talked about normative referencing? So in normative referencing, I would test all of you, and I would find out how you've compared against each other. So there would be, as we do on the bell curve, so many A's, so many B's, so many C's, and there'd be a few folks that would fail. And I've been in situations where I've met students who have been assessed under the bell curve, and they will get the same grade in two classes. One will be an A- and one will be a B+ or a B-. Same grade, same program, same university, but because they were done on the bell curve, the students in one class were super behind this person, so their grade went up. And in the other one, they're super in front of this person, so their grade went down. And yet it was the same grade. With criterion referencing and using these kinds of standard descriptors, what you're doing is you're actually putting each of you not against each other, but against the criterion that I have set up for you to learn in this course. So each of you has a shot at 100%, all the time, every day. I've given you the criterion, I've told you what it is that I'm expecting from you, I'm asking you to get to the exceptional category whenever you feel comfortable getting there. I'm happy to help you all along the way. So technically, everybody in this course should get 100. It doesn't happen that way because all things interfere. People don't understand concepts sometimes. Sometimes I had a really bad day teaching and you didn't get it. I get that. All sorts of things happen. But really, when it comes to criterion referencing, if I've spent a lot of time on my criterion and I've handed it out to my students, then everybody should be able to know the qualities and elements of the work that's being looked for, which means they all should be able to get 100. And there's nothing wrong with that, although the university will sometimes tell you there is something wrong with that. Remember the first time I taught, I walked into a replacement position with a faculty member who sat down, and he was so kind, and he said, now, there's only going to be so many A's, so many B's, and so many C's in this class. And that's the way you do it. And I thought to myself, there's something inherently wrong with that. Even before I had my master's, I knew there was something wrong with that. Because if I'm a good teacher and you're a good student and the content is well presented, why should you get a B? Because there are other people in the class that happen to be stronger than you at that moment in time. Even when you get all the marks that you're supposed to get. So there I was on the road to criterion referencing without even knowing what it was called. And I remember sitting down and having this conversation with that instructor, and he shook his head because he had come from the world of normative testing, and he thought, no, this is not going to work. And every now and then I'd get hauled into his office and said, you know, you got too many A's, right? And I'd go, yeah. And then I'd go back and do exactly what I'd done the first time, so it's all right. Secondly, standard descriptors. They assist markers in determining student grades by providing information about typical mid-level achievement within each standard. So if we go back to those original criteria, here, you've got satisfactory and good. They're mid-level. There's always a wow. Somebody over-accomplishes, overachieves, just goes way off the scale, more than you ever anticipated. You leave those for the excellent category. Some folks try really hard, give them lots of extra time, give them lots of extra assistance, and sometimes they just need more than you can accomplish. So in those cases, they need improvement. They're still needing to improve all the way through the process. but you've set up the sort of good and standard mediums. So it's a typical mid-level achievement. So when you have your standard descriptors doing those things, what you do is you put the control of the learning in the hands of the student. They get to control what they do and what they don't do. And you do get the odd adult that will sit there and say, no, you know, I don't think I'm going to really try for an A this term because I'm exhausted. I've got 4 trips, 2 new babies at home, it's minus 40. I think I might just be okay with a B this term. And they will do what they need to do within that. Adults make those kinds of decisions. So what do? They describe evidence, they describe the quality of the student response, they give meaning to the mid-range or the typical standard, they use words which are descriptive and comparative, not just comparative. They contain positive statements, use language that's not derogatory, and use unambiguous language. So that's why they take time to create. You can't just write off a rubric in 5 minutes and say, okay, we're done. Now you could, if you wanted to pilot test it over 2 or 3 terms and find that you need to tweak it all the time. But to really create good descriptors, good criterion, you really need to sit down and think about it. What it is do I want the students to do? Under what context do I want them to do it? How do I want those connections to be made in the content that creates this? And then how do I tell them in a way that's positive they've accomplished what they need to accomplish or that they need to improve? So those performance and standards should start by going back to the intended outcomes. How many people here have outcomes, learning outcomes in their classrooms? Everybody? Excellent. Because it's amazing how many people don't. And if you don't know, it's sort of like that old adage with Alice, right? If you don't know where you're going, how do you know when you get there? Something like that. So the learning outcome tells the student where you want them to be at the end. At the end of the course, I want you to. So the performance descriptor could easily go back to those learning outcomes, come up with a way for those learning outcomes to actually be a critical component in the rubric. You also want to write a description of what the students need to do to meet the criterion sufficiently to demonstrate that they've created the learning outcome. So if your learning outcome says describe, then you may want to have a descriptor that actually goes into all of the ways all of the levels of description that you might be looking for. If you're asking them to synthesize this information, then your descriptor might have levels of synthesization. That's not a word. Of the ways to synthesize this particular component or information. If you want them, for example, if a learning outcome is that you want them to get to know referencing how to reference materials properly, then you would have a learning or a descriptor that would say, sometimes used APA, moderately used APA, used APA all the time and did it well. When you reflect back on the minimum requirement to demonstrate the achievement, to what extent do students need to include each element when they're to be considered, that can be considered when writing the descriptor. And then once you've created the pass, so this is one of the little hints that you can use, create the pass. Here's what they have to meet. This is adequate, this is average, this is pass, this is good. And then you do better and best, not so adequate and bad. And then you give yourself a bit of a way around. Start in the middle. This is if you could have the average student, or if you could create a pass descriptor down the center, and then as they suggest, the challenge is to come up with all of the things that come in front of it and all the things that come behind it. So how do you use the rubric? When marking a task with criterion and referenced and performance descriptors of the rubric, you assign a grade for each criterion. So this is back to Kyle's question, which should be relatively straightforward. So we can be a single grade for a single column. It can be grades within the column, as was pointed out by Megan. It could also be a range. And then you can use that range to literally sort of say they met the criterion but at the low end, they met the criterion but at the higher end. As well, it also talks to the quality of the student's performance that can be compared with the descriptions. So you've got the grade, and it also connects to the quality. When making the comparison, make a holistic judgment about the standard that mostly matches. So one of the advantages of the rubric is you're not walking into the assessment process alone. You're walking in armed with a rubric that you've shared with your students, that they are aware of in advance of the test, which is why I kind of like the idea of giving them some heads up as to how you're thinking and why you're doing it. Because that way then they can think about how that impacts what they're about to do, rather than it impacts them immediately at that second when they don't have time to adjust. Put that in your kitty, take it with you to your marking assignment, and suddenly you're able to sort of say, I judge that you are here and not here, and here's why. I judge that you're here and not here, and here's why. And all of those things then become a legitimate reason that students can live with, right? Because I've had students come back to me, and they always do, I mostly work with grad students, and they come back and they say, how did you arrive at that? Like, I've given them the rubric and I've given them the written explanation, but they still want to know how I arrived at it. And I can go into more detail. I can say, if you look at the rubric, based on this, I wanted this, and this is what you gave me. This is where what you gave me was lacking in more detail than what I might have given them in their first assessment. So I can dig deeper into the assignment and sort of say, here's why I chose here and not here. If you can show me a good argument why you think it should be here and not here, I'm willing to entertain that. I'm willing to think about it. I'm willing to give it another look and assess differently if I feel that you're correct and I've made a mistake. But it literally allows you to have a standard that mostly matches or is mostly equivalent to the way the student has demonstrated what they know, understand, or are able to do. So you come to the table with your experience, your knowledge of the discipline, your way of understanding how these things need to be judged, but this gives you that extra comfort to be able to say, okay, not only does the student understand this is how I'm going to do it, but this is how I'm going to do it. And it takes the subjectiveness, if you like, to some extent out of the picture. It allows you to become a little bit more objective. It's also important to note that students demonstrate sometimes an achievement that's just right out of the park. You didn't expect it. And it doesn't get described by any of the standards. So that's when your professional judgment comes into play. So performance descriptors should not be used in a restrictive way. And it's interesting because I have had instructors that have used them as restrictions rather than as expectations that can be exceeded. And so you have to think about them from a point of view of they are there and they give you that standard by which you want to measure, but every now and then you just get that student and you think to yourself, my goodness, at that age and at that knowledge level and at that place, I would never have come up with that. So that's really core and key. And you sometimes will get a student that will also do the criterion in a way you didn't expect, and sometimes it's not as pleasant as the, oh my goodness, side. So use them as they are meant, which is that you combine your professional judgment with the standard you've set for the course, but recognize that you sometimes might need to intervene because somebody will have done something quite outside the box, and you just need to play with that. So beyond the rubric, which is even probably more effective, is the feedback. Because sometimes you'll find folks will sit down and they will have the rubric only and not give back any feedback. So they'll check those boxes, but won't say anything specific to the person's work. And that really, I think, needs to be a fundamental learning and teaching activity. So you use the rubric as the starting point to your conversation with the student. It becomes the thing that you pass on to them in terms of teaching and learning. It has a significant impact on student learning and achievement. Feedback is incredible. If you give the feedback to the right student at the right time in the right place, they will improve. If you wait until the very end, and I don't know about you, but I'd wait for my grade, I'd never look at the feedback because it doesn't matter anymore. I can't get better at anything that I do in this course. You've given me my 68. That's all I can do. Whereas if your feedback is critical throughout the process, you can get the student to the point where they're actually using the feedback to improve what they're doing. It's also important to recognize that the research suggests it has a bigger impact on student learning and satisfaction than you'd ever realize. Most students can go back to a particular time in their world where they would have liked to have just known a bit more from the instructor about what it is that's happening. And then, of course, you can integrate many of the feedback opportunities in the learning activities that take place, both during the class, whether it's online, face-to-face, or blended. But feedback is critical. So here's some ideas about what is effective feedback. So everybody knows they can just sort of say, yes, good job. Doesn't tell me anything. Can I improve? You only gave me a 75. I did a good job. What does that mean? How can you break that down a little bit more? So maybe you might want to identify and positively reinforce what they did well. I really liked the way you used your language to describe this. I'm really impressed with the way that you tied these two concepts together. However, I noticed that in fact, what you could have done is gone one step further and done this, because you've made useful suggestions on how they can improve. You can also go, I really appreciated how you connected A and B. However, it's been my experience that A and B don't connect really well. A and C are a better connection. So give some thought to how A and C might connect rather than A and B. I'm really happy that you were able to do what you did. I think you did a very fine job. You did a solid performance. You accomplished everything I'd asked you to accomplish. It's timely, so that I try and get feedback back to students no later than 24 to 48 hours after an assignment or a test. Not always possible. Sometimes it's a week, sometimes it's 2, but you have to tell them when it's coming and be honest about it. So if I say I'll have it to you by Sunday and it's not ready, I send them a note and say, sorry guys, got tied up on Sunday, never got it finished, it'll be Monday now. But if you tell them, then they'll be able to do that. And finally, it enables students to refine their capacity to use information to judge themselves. So they'll use the kind of information that you have available to you, that you have given to them, to make themselves better. Not maybe in your class, but definitely in someone else's. And if they're part of a discipline or a certification or a diploma or a degree, those are always good things because they will just simply move on and become better at what they do. So very quickly, I just want to let you know that written comments, you start by highlighting a strength, you identify 1 to 2 areas where they might have, 1 to 3 areas where they might need improvements, and you end on a note of encouragement. I really like the way you tied these two things together. I probably would have looked at A and B as well to make sure that they didn't have some connection to C and D. However, having done that, you did a really nice job of tying them together, and I really appreciated the fact that you put this extra effort in and you used the more than 5 references that I asked you for. So there are my references. They're all APA. So I don't know if you have any questions, comments, quibbles, queries, concerns, quandaries, and otherwise quagmires. No?
I'm just wondering if we can get one of the e-learning specialists to describe quickly what the
Sure.
Rubric tool in EClass is all about, what it does for you. Any of you guys want to pick that up?
Well, it's really easy to set up actually. You actually already have your rubric on paper. EClass allows you to put it in block by block what you already have. The assignment tool lets you look at the student's assignment at the same time as you have your rubric over here, so you can read it through and then just click on the boxes that apply. So it really automates your time because everything is all in one place. You can get comments at the same time. And then once you're done, the student can see everything you did. So that's what EClass allows you to do with your rubric. It's, like I said, very simple and straightforward to set up. If you want help with that, always email us at leolearn@ualberta.ca.
And there are some other tips too, like if you have really descriptive descriptors as an example, and a fairly large rubric, your rubric in EClass is going to get really unmanageable, so it's always worth having like an actual copy of like your official rubric to give to students, and then maybe just use an abbreviated rubric in EClass so it doesn't get like you have to scroll. Otherwise it's really frustrating for students to have to deal with it, and it's really frustrating for you as an instructor to have to go through and manage that crazy interface.
I highly recommend that you put your rubrics in your syllabus so the students know from the very beginning that what your intentions are. At the very least, if you're not going to put them in your syllabus, make sure that there's a note in your syllabus that says the rubrics can be found on EClass and here's where they are, and have them examine them in advance of the course assessment, because that way then they can come to you for clarification. They can come to you and say, okay, this is what you said for the assignment and this is what the rubric says, and I'm not seeing a connect here. I'm seeing a bit of a disconnect. Can you explain it? And then you can explain it, and it doesn't matter again if you're face-to-face, blended, or online. All of those opportunities to tell the student how the rubric works is open to you through email or through a personal visit or whatever. Any questions, queries, comments, concerns, quagmires? No? All right. I don't know if I'm going to just announce, this is my last workshop with Leo. I am leaving the 1st of March to go to Calgary to work with SAIT. So if you need to see an instructional designer anytime soon, I would advise doing it in the next 2 weeks. Thank you very much. And thank you to our online company. They didn't have any questions, I'm guessing. Excellent. Thank you, everybody.